Hello, class. My name is Kurt Peterson. I'll be your professor for History 5230, Christian History 3, or North American Christianity, taught the spring of 2025 at North Park Theological Seminary. I will walk through the syllabus. We'll do course introduction as well as individual introductions the first night of class. But I thought I would send along some content here to open a discussion and provide a framework for beginning our work together next week. This course is called North American Christianity. So of course that means that it will focus on what is now North America, primarily the United States, a little bit about Canada, and certainly when we talk about early colonial settlement, we'll also have some conversation about religion in the Americas, or Central and South America. But we will focus on what is today, culturally and geographically, and with respect to government, the United States of America, though that won't be our only focus. Indeed, we are a country that is comprised of people from all over the whole world. So it will be diverse and creative and energetic and exciting and a little bit confusing at times as so many influences come into play. When you teach North American Christianity, a dominant European Protestant mode tends to control the narrative. We oftentimes start our story with the Puritans, the Mayflower Puritans who settled in Plymouth in 1620, and the Massachusetts Bay Puritans who settled in Boston or Cambridge in 1630. And then from there developed the religious institutions and the government and the cultural institutions that drove American life. And we tell the story as kind of starting from there, and then everything else peppers the story, but that's the dominant narrative. But why is it that the Puritans tend to be the focus of the story, right? There were Spanish and Portuguese Catholics in North America. There were French Catholics and Protestant Huguenots here before the Puritans settled in Plymouth and in Massachusetts. Furthermore, there were Anglicans who settled in Roanoke and Jamestown, Virginia, before the Puritans settled in New England. So why is it that we tend to start our story in New England, in Massachusetts? There's a lot of reasons for that, and we can talk about this along the way. We'll do a little bit more talking about this next week. But one of them is that because that's the way historians have told the story, right? That's probably the primary reason. The other is that Boston became the center of a particular understanding of America that was also somewhat different but shared in the middle colonies in and around Virginia, that gave birth to a certain sense of what America was and what America could be, about what rights were, about opposition to taxation from the British government and the English control of the Americas. And so there's a series of thought and thinkers and institutions that come out of New England that tend to drive and dominate American intellectual and cultural life. So it's important to realize that while that is a story that we will tell together, this will also be a very diverse story because more than one kind of culture came here. People from all over the world came here. There's more than one kind of American Christian. There's certainly more than one kind of American religion. Along the way, we'll talk about Catholicism and Protestantism, all kinds of Protestants, as well as indigenous religion, African-American spirituality, African spirituality, Haitian voodoo, a whole series of things that will come into that story. One way of thinking about the way I'm going to teach the class is that there will be a sort of mainstream, fairly consistent, shared narrative of Christianity in North America that you would see basically almost anywhere you took a course like this. So we'll talk about religion before Europeans came, very briefly. We'll talk about colonization of the Americas and of North America. We'll talk about the early Puritans as opposed to the early Anglicans. We'll talk about slaveholding societies. We'll talk about revivalism and religion after the Civil War, and the religion of immigrants in the late 19th century, the rise of Pentecostalism and fundamentalism, new evangelicalism, evangelical America, all the kinds of things into the 20th and 21st century that you might predict. But along the way, we're going to trouble that narrative, interrupt it a little bit from all kinds of influences that go into the story. So, for example, one of the books we're going to be reading this semester is Daniel Ramirez's Migrating Faith, which is about Pentecostalism in the United States and Mexico in the 20th century. Really, until about 10 or 15 years ago, the Pentecostalism story was really an African American and a white story. Not so much a Latin American story, and this really problematizes and changes that narrative. And so we'll be telling that story together in a very interesting and kind of way. So we will have a dominant, relatively traditional or predictable dominant narrative with a lot of other stories that trouble it along the way. I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a North American Christian. While there might be a dominant narrative, certainly there are Protestants, right? There are all kinds of Protestants. Episcopalians from the Church of England settled in Virginia. Methodists in the Middle Colonies. Reformed Anglicans and Reformed other Calvinist groups in the New England area. There were Lutherans in what is now Pennsylvania and other parts of those colonies. There were radical inheritors of the Radical Reformation or Anabaptists in various parts of early America. There were, of course, Catholics, and Catholics of all kinds and nationalities in North America. There were also Jews, a fairly good number of them, but they certainly didn't dominate in terms of culture. And while not very many, there were even some early Muslims in American life. We'll tell some of that story together, as well as the way that Islam influenced African spirituality, especially in North Africa, by the time many of those folks wound up coming on slave ships to the Americas. Though it was West Africa that dominated that migration. We'll also talk about indigenous religion. It's difficult to understand most what we would call Native American or indigenous religion and culture in American life, largely because of a lack of sources, specifically with respect to religion. So what we often wind up having to do is use archaeological evidence, as well as we read through the European accounts and try to assess the cultures that they were demeaning or judging, some valuing, to see what they were actually like on their own terms. Europeans dismissed most indigenous culture as subpar, as heathens living in darkness that needed to be redeemed by a westernized European Christian God. There were 500 or more independent religious cultures in the Americas before Europeans ever got here. They tended not to separate life between the sacred and the secular. They were closely bound to nature, believed that all nature pulsated with the divine. This is why well into the 19th and even the 20th century, the idea to a Native American that you could own land never made any sense. But of course, to Europeans, it made perfect sense. There were shamans and medicine men and women who helped interpret the spiritual world into the present. We also want to be aware, in terms of the diverse tapestry of American religious life, of African and African American spirituality. Those Africans who settled in America obviously believed in an afterlife. West Africans believed in a great variety of spirits. The physical world was run by gods, a whole network of them. They practiced divinization, the predicting of things to come, as well as mediums and shamans communicated supernatural messages to people. They were heavily influenced by Islam in North Africa. Also, even early on, by Christian missionaries, some before coming to the New World. Of course, no treatment of this particular reality in American life cannot be discussed thoroughly without a clear understanding of America's original sin, and that is the sin of slavery. That millions of Africans were brought against their will across the Atlantic made to fill the role of chattel slave to white landowners. The result is an incredibly significant and important story that will animate the history of African American religion that will be part of our conversation along the way in very significant ways this semester as well. And then finally, we should also be aware of Latin American religion and spirituality. Of course, in the colonial era, what is now Texas, Arizona, New Mexico was all New Spain. There were missions and Catholic presence in those places. The oldest churches in the country are not in New England. They're in New Mexico. In addition to that, after 1965 and change of immigration laws in American life, Latin American immigration has absolutely transformed the contours of American Christianity. Right now in Chicago, almost 1 in 4 people have Spanish as their first language in the greater Chicago area. It's more than 1 in 5. And so we'll talk about that particular story through immigration and a changing landscape in American evangelicalism as well. So what does it mean to be an American Christian? Well, it means a lot of things in a lot of varied stories to be able to tell along the way. With that, I'm going to finish this particular discussion. Then I'm going to move on in a little bit to a discussion about some of the historical background context for early colonial settlement that helped make sense out of the reading in our conversations this first week of class. Thanks.